get it wrong, get the timing wrong, and that can have, ultimate failure in terms of delivery. Being equipped, time management, those project management skills were absolutely key. Understanding where you need to get to and working backwards is something that I very much learned at the beginning of my career and have taken through. And it's shown, from my perspective, a lot of success on landing things successfully and at the right time. I think sometimes we go in believing we need to know everything and we're not going to. You've got to have that attitude. There's that guilt element, I think it's fair to say, of how do you balance everything? You've got a career and you want to do well in your job. Talked earlier about being a perfectionist, so making sure you get that right, to having a family, but also having that avenue for me as an individual. And at one point, I think it's fair to say it wasn't going in the right direction. It was a challenging career and that sort of progression upwards. I had 2 young children and I was trying to balance something alongside that. It's tapping into those elements of perhaps insecurities. Everybody has strengths and weaknesses, and it's how we can work collectively as a team and how individually I can support as a leader, triangle of success. And it's really around that sort of skills, knowledge and attitude piece. And those sort of 3 fundamentals have certainly been key for me in my career and how I've moved things on as I've sort of developed within role and within different sectors. Over the last 2 years, I've definitely gone around with various parties in the organisation to challenge, hybrid working principles. How do we get that great balance between home working, which, as you say, certainly achieves some great outputs in terms of, I feel for me, we've absolutely gone away from presenteeism.
In this podcast series, we're talking to inspiring leaders of procurement and supply chain. Join me as we explore their journey, their achievements, and their career advice. This way, you can integrate them into your career and achieve the same. I'm Marco Marambe, Managing Director at Procurato. Hi, today we're speaking to Lucy Thompson, who is the Head of Corporate Services at MPS.
Hello.
Welcome, Lucy.
Thank you, and thank you for the invite.
Nice to see you here again, and it'd be good for us to get into your role. And hopefully, as you know, people who are watching this will be able to get some interesting insight of your career, and we'll be able to dive deeper into it, I'm sure, as we progress. But before I do that, let's start with getting to know you as the person. So if people were to describe to me who Lucy is, let's say your family first, how would they describe you?
Fun, a bit of an extrovert, incredibly driven, and a kind and caring person.
Great. And now your friends?
Pretty much the same, I would say. Perhaps more fun.
Yeah. So if you could give me a little bit of your background as well for people to understand where you came from, how you started.
So I left university with a business management degree. Yeah. And at that time, really quite unsure about where I wanted to take my career, indeed, the sort of sector I wanted to move into. Yeah. So I took the opportunity to move into a temporary administration role, which was for a main contractor within the construction industry. Mm-hmm. And at that time, an experienced and great project manager definitely saw the potential that I could do more than that, obviously, the ask at the time. So he put me forward for the graduate management scheme. And at that time, very flexible in terms of where my role took me within that scheme itself. But with the business management degree, the financial, the strategic, the analytical side, as well as that sort of legal overlay, it really did take me into that emphasis of procurement being the area that really did interest me.
And did you actually know procurement at that point, or was it more sort of you stumbled into it in that way?
Definitely stumbled into it. I actually think procurement's not still out there really on the career map, or it's certainly got better over time, but certainly 20 plus years ago, I probably hadn't even heard of procurement at that stage. So it was really interesting. And I think particularly in the industry I'd gone into, procurement wasn't really there as a title in many main contractors. It was very much quantity surveying and that commercial overlay. So a really sort of different angle for that business and almost for me to go into as well.
Yeah. And you were talking a little bit about the traits and things that you actually liked. Mm-hmm. What aspects of your traits did you feel like were a real good match in that case when you thought, that's really a good fit for me?
Yeah, I'm very task-driven, very output-focused. I think actually that friendly side of me and that confidence of being able to get that level of engagement with suppliers very much up front. Definitely those analytical skills. You're really sort of getting into the nitty-gritty at the outset and looking at what difference we can make. Certainly for me, played through. And I think thinking about that industry, it was very, very male dominated. And as a result, that sort of hard-working ethos I had really came into play. At the very outset, it was a focus on learning about the industry, being an equal, understanding not only about what procurement was, but actually what you needed to do, particularly where some of the suppliers, they can be very challenging, if not a little bit hard-nosed at times. So it was not only having that sort of engaging side, but very much that tenacious attitude, which I think I also have very much from a work perspective.
Yeah, it's a tough one probably at that point in time. As you say, the industry is one of the tougher ones to get into, having to do then the procurement and supply chain. As you know, it has quite a significant amount of skills that you need to have.
Yeah.
How did you find all those negotiations at that point, at the beginning part of your career, and actually discussing with your various suppliers and internal colleagues?
For me, very challenging initially.
I bet.
The key for me was really getting to grips with what the ask was. I mean, obviously in the construction world, you are very, very driven to lead times. Get it wrong, get the timing wrong, and that can have, ultimate failure in terms of delivery. So being equipped, time management, those project management skills were absolutely key.
Yeah.
And I think I talked earlier about being that sort of output-driven individual. Understanding where you need to get to and working backwards is something that I very much learned at the beginning of my career and have taken through. And it's shown, from my perspective, a lot of success on landing things successfully and at the right time.
Yeah, and I suppose you would have been coached and supported by some colleagues as such, but I'm also sure that you would have used some of your normal sort of natural skills to get into understanding that aspect of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think sometimes it's that not being fearful of asking for help, going into something that is entirely new. And we'll all have that situation where whether we move into a new role, whether we move into a new industry, a new organisation, I think sometimes we go in believing we need to know everything, and we're not going to. And actually seeking out, working with, whether that's peers, seniors, or colleagues that actually know what, they are the ones that are driving the end output. So I think very, very, for me, it's around engaging, not only around stakeholders and those around you that can add value, but also tapping in. And I think there's that sort of triangle I call, and some people call it the triangle of triumph or triangle of success. And it's really around that sort of skills, knowledge and attitude piece. And those sort of three fundamentals are certainly been key for me in my career and how I've moved things on as I've sort of developed within role and within different sectors.
And of those three, where do you feel you're more akin to or more aligned to? Attitude,
probably.
Yeah.
I think skills you can develop. Absolutely, you can work with those people, but you've got to have that attitude. I talked earlier about that sort of personal trait and actually how that weaves into work, of being determined, of being hardworking, and really bringing those elements in. Absolutely, attitude is key. And it's stepping outside of the unknown sometimes, challenging yourself, and that attitude can really sort of start to drive that success.
Yeah, I personally agree. You have to really put yourself out there and try and push yourself to get better as well. And that's attitude is the main aspect for you to get a successful, ambitious career as such. So that's great. So you were going through this whole process, learning quite a few things, probably being given some pretty large, difficult tasks to deliver. And as part of this journey, I'm sure you've had to interact with a lot of people. How did that aspect of influencing your colleagues, influencing more senior people, all of that. How did it go about, and what was your approach to actually getting to influence them and making sure that you can communicate the right message to them?
Indeed, yeah. Obviously, communication is key, but I think it's around that mindset of collaboration.
Yeah.
And I think I got a really good introduction at one point where a senior colleague introduced this sense of taking people on a journey. And it sounds probably corny to some, but that is really, really key. That level of upfront engagement. We talk about the change curve and the impact that change might have on people. And whether that's initially that level of frustration or it's that tapping into the unknown. So really bringing people on at the very outset of whatever you're trying to deliver, first and foremost, really creates that level of advocacy. And with advocacy, creates that level of enthusiasm and supports people through change. But also you're tapping into other facets that you perhaps wouldn't have considered alone. So I think from my perspective, we talk stakeholder engagement, we talk communication, and we talk collaboration. But very much that journey piece for me, is fundamentally key.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think that a lot of these things, they're complex and nuanced ways of actually achieving successful careers and doing things. But when you break it down,
yes,
it is those simple things which make you successful. And, taking people on the journey is probably one of the stronger points that I would support as well in that conversation. Great. So you obviously progressed there. You took your people and colleagues across on your journey, and you've actually talked them through everything they were going to do, and you managed to, win every little project at a time and progress. And then you probably got to a point where, right, I now want to progress and do something else. I want to move up the ladder. I want to be promoted. How did you approach that? Was it one whereby stakeholders, senior managers approached you and said to you, oh, you're doing really good at this. Would you be interested in doing more? Or did you have to push for it yourself?
Personally, I found that I think those individuals definitely saw what I could deliver and the value of my role, and very much stepped into the side of asking me to take on more, and actually stepping outside of what we know traditionally as procurement in its truest sense, transactional procurement, very much into that transformational side. And I initially got the opportunity to be part of leading the introduction of an ERP solution for the organisation. And you can imagine the complexities of bringing in those variable facets.
That's your big project, sounds like.
Huge project. And again, that was key around getting that collaboration and engagement. Again, we don't know everything, and we're going to have to tap into those variable skill sets, whether that is working with the supplier. And when we talk supplier, I'm very keen on almost differentiating between a supplier in its truest sense and one of which will become a delivery partner for the organisation. So really tapping into that expertise from a supplier base of what we need and when we need it by, and how we achieve those desired goals and outcomes. Also overlaying those technical competencies that we definitely need to glean and obtain from elsewhere, often within the organisation.
And at that point, were you, 3-4 years into your career at that point?
Yeah, around 3 to 4 years into the career.
In your career, probably learning for the first time some of these things.
Absolutely.
How did you go about, getting that knowledge and gaining the knowledge? For anyone watching this and wanting to get into a big project or having been tasked with something so big, how did you go about it?
From my perspective, obviously you can read as much as you can. I mean, let's be frank, we always love to drop onto Google when we need to. So you can really get to grips with that's the user case studies that perhaps other organisations have used to understand the subtle nuances of how that system has been built and integrated. But there's nothing more than having that conversation, working in and sort of getting into that project team environment, ensuring when you're working in that project team environment, you're clear on the roles and responsibilities, what people are doing and what knowledge they have that you can really tap into. Yeah. And for me, that has been, again, a real sort of key tool that I've used. And again, I went back, I think we talked about it earlier, but not being afraid to ask. We don't know everything. And that for me is something I learned very early on in my career.
Yeah. So there's a level of engagement that you need to do with people who have access probably to that knowledge.
Yeah.
And I'm sure you must have spent quite a bit of time in the beginning to sort of identify that. It sounds like you're quite a planned person and make sure you've got a structure. So that all probably fits in nicely with a point of getting supporters, sponsors, even at that point in your career, mentors, whatever you may want to call it. How important was it at that point in your career to identify those kind of people, and how did you go about approaching them?
I actually think it was then and now. I'm a massive advocate of coaching and mentoring. I'm a coach and a mentor, and I am also coached. And I think that
Agree.
It doesn't matter at what stage in life we are in our career and how experienced we think we are. We can always learn so much from somebody. And actually, that type of element is, for me, it's the ability for somebody to tap into, we talk about insights, but really get to understand what we don't know about ourselves. And actually using those individuals not only to help us through that discovery phase of where our career is going, but also to get us to understand perhaps what we haven't seen. So and I think elements such as that through the early part of my career was very much focused on resilience, how I might approach people in a different guise. I talked earlier that I'm an extrovert. I'm naturally an extrovert. And we then will work with people that are introverts. And sometimes that can almost create that level of uncertainty because the interaction is very, very different.
Yeah.
So it's working on those skills and qualities we have, but working a way to almost tap into those uncertainties that we have and use them to our strength.
That's a really good, interesting point, and something probably I've been reflecting on myself, and it's a conversation that we often have, is extrovert, introvert, right?
Yeah.
As an extrovert, and frankly, I believe I'm probably half-half, but more often I'm akin to being an extrovert. What approach do you have when, building or working with a team, whether it's a project team or actually building your own team, of making sure that the introverts take part in those conversations, and not only take part in the conversations, but work with you as smoothly as you can?
Yeah, I think actually that extrovert-introvert conversation taps very well into what I really strongly believe in, which is psychological safety.
Yep.
I spend a lot of time with my teams. We regularly catch up. And that's not just in a one-to-one space, but also working collectively as a team. And that's around celebrating success. But it's also about tapping into those elements of challenge. It's the tapping into those elements of perhaps insecurities. Everybody has strengths and weaknesses, and it's how we can work collectively as a team and how individually I can support as a leader in setting individuals' goals. But also, I believe a strong part is not just looking at it solely with the hat on of the work environment. People's personal lives have a big part to play, not only in how they perform, but also what they are driven by. So I think it's really, really key that first and foremost, you create that trust and that trusting environment, and the ability not only to tap into perhaps or be aware of individuals' vulnerabilities, but also provide that almost level of assurance that everybody has a vulnerability. And it's that transparency piece that for me creates trust. It creates a really strong team ethos, and everybody in that group environment can work with and learn from each other. And I think that's, for me, really key. It's not about individuals. We're not doing it for ourselves. We do it for the team. And when you get a great, strong team that feel empowered to deliver,
I totally
you can achieve great success.
Totally agree. And getting different parts of the team, people with different views, it's a well-known fact. It's probably something that many people say you need to have a variety of a team for you to achieve. So, in fact, I was reading recently something about, the CEO of Airbnb, who was talking about not being a great fan of lots of big, large meetings, because if you're not inputting, then there is no point in that person being there. So you should really try and have small meetings. I'm not sure I'm a full advocate for that, for the precise point that we've just discovered. So to give some people maybe practical advice, you've got an introvert sitting there across the room. Often people internalize things and then probably take them out. How would you go about? Do you typically just ask people, put them on the spot, or maybe you just try and get the conversation and simply just, without putting them on the spot, but just asking the question, what do you think? How do you go about these?
So I think firstly, one of the skills that I think is key when we talk sometimes as an introvert, or indeed people that are early in their career, so they're maybe not naturally introverted, but don't necessarily have that level of confidence. When we talk strategy, it seems huge. It's that sort of when you say to somebody who perhaps doesn't understand even what is meant by strategy or what we're trying to achieve, for me, it's key to break it down and build the elements that are operational into where do we need to get to from a strategic perspective. And I think once you break it down into bite-sized pieces and give somebody a bit of a context to the part they play, first and foremost, that confidence builds.
Yeah.
The introverts are not necessarily in the room to have the loudest voice. So what I often do is work with those individuals on a one-to-one basis. Similarly, in my role, it's not just about working with my direct team. It's about working across the organisation. And I'm keen that everybody has a voice. So what we found is varying different routes to be able to get and obtain feedback or give a view of what part they want to play. And sometimes those individuals I found are more... the natural way of them working is perhaps to drop you an email or to drop a question into a different guise and not necessarily be faced off against a direct question in a room.
In a room full of other people. Sometimes maybe just a direct conversation. Oh, that's really good. You also mentioned, of course, the fact that personal lives play a lot into this. You are probably you've grown your career. You're now probably at that stage where you're starting to get into middle management. It's natural that our lives evolve as well. Yeah. Just interesting to find out sort of things about maybe something about your personal life that people may not know, who know you in the workplace, which has had a good or a difficult impact in your career, or a great impact in your career, which you'd like to share with us.
So I think from my perspective, I'm a mum, I've got 2 children, 2 lovely boys, 13 and 9. But also one of the sides that I've had as an interest for many, many years is horse riding. And one of the things I found certainly has been the balance of that work life. You've become a mother, you've got a hobby, you've got a job, and it's that level of work-life balance that's often a challenge. Mm-hmm. And it's certainly something there's that guilt element, I think it's fair to say, of how do you balance everything? You've got a career and you want to do well in your job. I talked earlier about being a perfectionist, so making sure you get that right, to having a family, but also having that avenue for me as an individual. And at one point, I think it's fair to say it wasn't going in the right direction.
Of course.
I had what was a challenging career and that sort of progression upwards. I had 2 young children and I was trying to balance something alongside that. And actually, I talked about it earlier, not being afraid to ask for help, because it got to a point where I was like, I'm going to have to give this hobby up. It's a huge part of my life, and it's something I absolutely love. But actually, asking for help, reaching out and making sure you've got that support network around you was key for me to be able to continue, balancing everything. And naturally, it goes back to that project management piece I talked about. You can definitely tap into some of those skills you learn at work, time management, resource management, etc. It really is key.
And I think one of the key things you're discussing here is really about the fact that there's a lot of things to juggle. And that's normal, but you have to do pretty much everything to achieve the career success. Is just about how you manage that everything, asking for help when you need to, also understanding when it's time to do more one thing than the other. Yep. So I would make an assumption that, for you to achieve the successful career you've achieved to date is very much a mix of all these things. Yes. And it's probably not necessarily a 9-to-5 situation when it comes to work as well, if you're trying to balance your family life at the same time.
Exactly.
Would I be right in assuming that?
I feel that, I think often we find, and particularly as these pressures that all organisations place on colleagues, is that a 9-to-5 job is often, it's even more complex to just deliver the role that you probably employed to do. And I've definitely had to sort of push myself, work those additional hours, be really clear in terms of where I want to go. Yeah. I think we should all challenge ourselves to understand what our future looks like, and without challenging yourself and perhaps giving the extra mile and putting that extra work in. Personally, I found that has been, played an instrumental part, because delivering your core role is not going above and beyond. And I think when you go above and beyond, people really see that sort of the quality and the ability that you have to deliver more.
Yeah, and I would take it that people identify that, see it, and probably it's an easier tool for you to then have that conversation. You talked about planning now a couple of times, and you talked a bit about your career plans. So if you talk about that. How do you normally approach it? Do you look at a 5-year plan, a 4-year plan? What do you put yourself in front of to plan how you're going to progress in your career? Do you have an approach?
Yeah, I think it's generally, I tend to have a 5-year plan. I don't know, I get to those birthdays, those large birthdays, and you go, where do I want to be as I hit that date? And so certainly from my perspective, I've really had that view of, at this particular point in my life, this is where I'd like to be. And interestingly, I talked earlier about really working outside of where you are now and what does that mean. So for myself personally, I've taken the opportunity to take on a far broader role and remit than just procurement. Absolutely, procurement, supply chain, etc. is at the core of what I do. But I've actually taken that sort of broader aspect of consideration of strategy, not just procurement strategy and procurement transformation, but organisational strategy and that very operational side. So at this present time, I'm responsible for business continuity and crisis management, which is really interesting,
I bet.
Particularly when we think about the supply chain and the impact that suppliers have in terms of delivery of service to the organisation, but also real estate. So again, another great facet to tap into procurement. There's probably many procurement professionals out there that have that real estate and facilities bias. So my target was very much definitely, what else can I do outside of procurement to tap into that view of me being seen as strategic, operational, as well as keeping those strong core competencies of procurement?
And naturally, if you are looking at a 5-year plan, you probably are being strategic in the first place, right? So do you go 5 years and then work your way backwards? Do you go 5 years is where I'd like to achieve, but let me look at the first year and these are the steps I'm going to take? How do you approach it normally?
I think naturally, in terms of where I've talked before, very much outcomes focused. Yeah. So I go to the point of going, where do I want to be? And then very much work backwards. So interestingly, I think there's times where see what that organisation can offer. I think we always go for this view of our 5-year plan. Where will it take us? In which organisation? Most organisations out there have a 5-year plan, have a 10-year plan in some instances. Those, there are a few out there that really just focus on that 3-year, very detailed strategy plan.
Yeah.
But actually part of it is, what can you offer into that organisation,
100%.
Tapping into their strategic and corporate goals, and really show that you've added the value to build. It's your CV at the end of the day. It's that personal element of your core competencies. And very much, if you're aware of what that is that the organisation is doing, have those conversations, put yourself forward, challenge yourself, put your hand up and say, I think I can really add some value here. Could I be involved, whether it's a project or an overarching intent for where the organisation is heading? Because I think sometimes, ultimately, it's only us that are in control of our own destiny.
Yeah, and it's a really good point. So what do you think has worked better for you? It could be a mix, but is it fulfilling those company big projects that you think would add the most value? Or was it really leveraging strongly on the skill set that you're very good at? And what's given you the more success?
For it's a little bit of both, but I love to see the end outcome. I love to build, see how much value I've offered in achieving something, in achieving success. To date, I still drive by or walk past projects that I've been involved with, and I sit back and go, wow, I played a part in this fabric of a museum or whatever that might be. Yeah. And I think sometimes maybe it's that sort of level of background that's taken me into more focusing on what I've achieved. And that's been a real, for me, it's very rewarding and uplifting.
I suppose the drive that one may have is very much important in achieving the things that you have, right? So if you have a 5-year plan and you're not getting there, what do you do? Do you go, right, I need to change my approach? Or do you go, maybe this is not right for me, I need to do something different?
I think there's different elements, isn't there? I think if you've got that strong organisation that's supporting it, it's just about doing something different, then what can you do differently? For example, I'm a strong believer in setting professional development plans and that individual taking ownership myself included.
Yeah.
And actually, if your organisation isn't doing something and can't support, what can you do outside of the work environment? And it's that element of introspection. And I think sometimes it's great to spend that time to step backwards from getting caught up in that day-to-day role to think, actually, what else do I need to tap into? And more recently, I've done a lot of work. I've done panel speaking events. Indeed, I'm here today. And I think sometimes it's stepping back, giving yourself time, first and foremost, to think, where am I now? Where do I want to be? And what do I now need to do to achieve it? And sometimes that's not always within the organisation, but it doesn't necessarily mean you have to move. It's whether you can draw down on different elements that can start to give you that level of drive and impetus for something new.
Yeah, of course. And if you take into account the fact that a career is not always a smooth path, right? There's always things which happen, errors. I think, I would see it that we're probably a semblance of many little mistakes we may have done along the way. Any fun, interesting errors you may have done at any part of your career that you'd like to share with us so that people can see, actually, it's not about, you don't get always perfection. Sometimes things do go wrong, but...
Yeah, it's actually a really interesting one, and it's one of I almost go back to from a perspective of we often overinflate an individual mistake.
Yeah.
And certainly the perfectionist in me would naturally do that. But very early on in my career, I went into construction. I mentioned to you that I had a lot to learn. The first project I took on solely, I had the great responsibility of taking off drawings. If nobody's aware of what the construction industry is, getting a big drawing out and neither doing a calculation based on block work, brickwork, in this instance, bollards for some external works. I miscounted.
Okay.
So the day that they were delivered, there were a few people scratching their heads on why so many had landed. And I think from my perspective, I internalised that as a huge mistake. To others, it wasn't an issue. It was quite. It was a bit of a comedy sketch, I think, of errors. However, looking back now and at the career stage I'm in, mistakes can happen. We're all human, and it's actually how we learn from those mistakes. And that example, I think, is key. Where I say, don't be afraid. At that particular point in my career, I was afraid to ask. I was afraid to get that support and feedback from others, when in actual fact, as I say, for me, it's key. Don't be afraid to learn and to say, I don't know, and seek that help and support from others around you.
Yeah, and I think, you build your career and you build your whatever you achieve by making small adjustments, tiny mistakes, things which happen. This sounds like it wasn't a great issue. I can assume if the perfectionist that you are at that time, you probably looked at yourself going, I can't believe I did this.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But the reality is, as you say, most colleagues would have probably forgotten that as well.
Exactly. They probably forgot it the next day.
Yeah, exactly.
I think I held on to it for far too many years. But as I say, I think sometimes these things need to happen to get that element of realisation that, we're not always going to get it right, but it's how we learn from that.
Yeah, exactly. So coming back to your progression in your career, you're at the stage where you've run projects, you maybe managed a few aspects of the project, maybe a few people, but not directly. But now you've been given the team, and you are now looking to achieve greater things as part of that. How do you build a good team? How do you go about that?
From my perspective, it's about building a vision and having that clear set of goals that we want to achieve, and goals are objectives. If you've got a vision and you're setting that example and direction of where the team are going, everybody is working to the same common purpose. But actually, we talked earlier, it's not my vision, it's not my objectives, it's not my goals. Of course, facets of that is very much driven by what the organisation needs and wants, but it's a team vision.
Yeah.
Because actually, by having that team vision, people are on board and people are working in the same direction, and they feel that they have a significant part to play. And that goes back to my sort of earlier conversation of very much advocacy, engagement, collaboration, and taking people on a journey. And it's as important with the organisation as it is with your teams. And it's not my team. it's our team, and I'm a really strong believer in that.
Yeah, and I'm assuming during this process at times you will have acquired people rather than necessarily. How did you go about that aspect? Because this is quite a complicated issue for a lot of people who get into that stage of their career. How did you go about identifying, right, this is a team I want to do, I want to have, these are the things we need to achieve. Unfortunately, some people may not be the right fit. And some others maybe needed to move or be trained to do other things to elevate within your team.
Yeah.
How do you approach these things? I appreciate it's not an easy task, but how do you approach that?
I have absolutely come across that. You come into an organisation, you inherit a function more often than not, and with that comes people. And certainly more recently, I've seen that there wasn't that vision, there wasn't that purpose. The team that were there invariably were procurement but by name, and actually their skill set didn't necessarily align to that overall vision and purpose of what I saw procurement being. And it wasn't about telling, actually working with that individual to tap into them recognising the role they had, what they did, where their strengths were. It naturally showed that they had less alignment to procurement.
I like the approach.
And it was almost that sort of moment of realisation that they then said, okay, I see I'm here, but actually I'm probably slightly misaligned, and this is where my role is. This is a part of the organisation I feel I best fit. In some instances, those people stayed within the organisation and picked up variable different roles and responsibilities elsewhere. And others, actually, it was a bit of a light bulb moment for them to say, actually, it's not here, but it's somewhere else, and this is what my role and future looks like. And I think actually getting to grips, even as simple as asking somebody to go back to my task-based conversation. What are your day-to-day tasks like? What do they look like? What is the percentage of your role if you break it down into facets that you believe you're tapping in and delivering procurement expertise into the organisation? And actually, when you see that on paper, it goes back to that light bulb moment piece.
That's great. And you've now got your team, you've identified who's good, you've got the team that you want as such. How do you go about now in the first, let's say, few months? Do you operate on a 90-day plan, 6-month plan? Do you go, I'm going to achieve these things in 6 months, talk to your leaders about them? How do you go about that aspect or that point in?
From my perspective, you have a 90-day plan for me is key for anybody. And the reason I say that is you don't actually know what you're trying to achieve if you've not tapped into the business. So very much at the outset, it's what I call discovery, really getting the opportunity to meet with key stakeholders, understanding the organisational change agenda, understanding the organisation's goals and strategic objectives. And that is often achieved by really getting close to the stakeholders. And I find a really great opportunity has been just taking half an hour, doing some introduction calls, not only from my perspective, but getting any new team member to tap in to certain individuals that are key to giving that sense of direction and purpose. Obviously, there's the standard stuff. It's the analytical data. It's taking your supplier information, understanding supplier segmentation. Again, that will be key because you need to really understand that sort of what has been done before to what needs to happen. And I think once you've done that discovery phase, it's what next. There'll absolutely be some tactical quick wins. And there'll be stuff that you can really get to grips with in terms of what you can do now, either individually or as a collective team. But there will also be that longer term strategic intent, whether that's supply rationalisation, whether that's a review of wider third-party risk management and what needs to go in to remediate perhaps some of the outstanding risk within the incumbent supply chain. That won't happen overnight.
No.
But at the same time as going on that strategic journey and that transformational journey, tap into those quick wins, because actually I think part of the challenge often I've certainly faced, and I think perhaps other procurement professionals have faced, is the value that is seen in procurement. More often than not, it's procurement do negotiation, procurement do some contracts for us. They put a few spanners in the works when we're trying to onboard a supplier and they tell us we need to go through a requisition and purchase order process. we are far more than that. And I think actually being seen at the outset very early on to deliver some of those quick wins that are often organisational frustrations will be key to starting to turn the dial on the perception of procurement.
Yeah.
And I think actually when we think about discovery, part of that discovery very much will be how are procurement perceived? What have procurement done before? But actually what is needed to shift the dial on that value piece.
Great. So you'd come in effectively and you build your team, you start actually interviewing, speaking to a number of people, stakeholders, and you actually start finding out what the situation is, what their perception is. And I suppose you give them this is what we're going to try and achieve in the next few months so that we can help you with that as such. And you keep them informed, I'm assuming, as you kind of progress?
Yeah, and it goes back to that journey piece. Sometimes it's, we talk racy sometimes, don't we? Are people informed or are they consulted? But actually, those that have got a real instrumental part to play, it's not just about consulting or informing. It's ensuring they have a place at the table. So, whether it's when we think about supplier due diligence and tapping into data privacy or information security, those teams have a part at the table to really play the right outcomes of what we need to achieve. Or it's around supplier ownership, if we think about supplier relationship management or vendor management. It's really tapping in not only to what the third party does now, but actually what they could do for the organisation. And again, that might align to organisational strategy, but it also goes down a level to really tap into wider team or divisional strategy. What are they trying to achieve and by when? And what value can you offer, your team offer, or that third party offer in taking you on into that sort of space of development, change and innovation?
Yeah, no, that completely makes sense. When you go through a whole plan of we're going to achieve these things, sometimes things change and, those strategic plans get influenced by the tactical situations. Do you feel, or in your experience, do you believe that actually sticking to your plan, of course you have to do minor variations, brings you more success? Or do you focus really on trying to fix the immediate issues, even though it detracts you completely from your plan, and then try and follow what the company's doing with your team? What has worked best for you in your experience?
Sticking to the plan where possible. There will always be elements of lines being blurred at times. There will be elements where you've taken down the wrong path for a short period of time, but always understand the direction you want to be, have that in your sort of line of sight. And whilst it can, you go off track on a couple of occasions, make sure you're keeping true to that sort of sense of purpose of where you need to go. More often than not, there's a reason for that, whether that is regulatory, whether that is intended to get those desired financial outcomes from the business. And we've got to recognise that sometimes people won't always understand why we're going down that route. So again, it's just more of a conversation. Yes, tactical quick win items can happen alongside, but really keep that sort of strong mindset of not being driven off track where possible.
That's really good. You are now in a pretty senior role. You've got yourself in a position where you're having to deal with a lot of quite senior stakeholders yourself. How do you go about setting up or building those relationships? Do you look at this and go, right, this is, I see where they have a gap and where I can add value? Or do you try and help across a variety of things as a team? How do you go about being part of this more senior roles and senior people, really?
Yeah, I think for me, it's tapping into the gaps. It's tapping into their wants and understanding, in some instances, working with them to get them to understand what their needs and wants are, particularly when we think about procurement. And I think that's key for me, because sometimes they don't always know the journey they want to go on. They're not quite sure about how they will achieve it. And an example might be, and certainly the journey I'm going on at the moment is third-party risk management. That overlay into, the FCA and the PRA guidelines, the view of how we use third parties that, in the broadest sense, are outsourced providers to the organisation, and how we can start to understand and minimise the impact and risk. We talked earlier around business continuity management, crisis management. Overlaid into that is operational resilience.
Of course.
And when we think about third parties delivering a business service line into the organisation that's instrumental to that organisation's delivery to their customers, clients, or members, it's really key to say, actually, what do I need to do differently, and how can I play a part in making sure we've got a strong and robust supply chain, in remediating any potential impacts that third party might have on business operations, but actually working with that third party, as I talked earlier, as a delivery partner, and not just sort of slogging against them. So, because actually the third party and the organisation very much do need to work hand in hand. So from my perspective, it's tapping into what you know are those sort of key concerns the organisation has, but also then working what part you can play in terms of remediating against some of those issues.
Yeah, and that sounds very true to me as well. So I suppose it's a natural thing that people who are doing our skills and our role, maybe they see us as quite skeptical.
Yes.
In terms of the benefit that a third party or supplier can bring. Do you have examples or situations where you felt that actually, you know what, this is really an important supplier and a partner that I need to work with? And how do you see that relationship as being important rather than something which is more transactional?
Yeah, so I think it's interesting when we think about the definition of a supplier versus a managed service. You know, a third party that can absolutely play an instrumental part in achieving the outcomes either for your team or for the business. And I've worked hand in hand with an organisation where when you set something up at the outset and you work with a third party, there's that determined end goal, and you achieve that end goal. But what you actually realise is you need to tap into those skills and competencies of that third party by way of transformation. You know, it's more often not once and done. It's around evolving. And actually, sometimes what we've got to do is be clear that we need those third parties and that skill set, not just by the time we've reached the end of a project or a specific output or a deliverable, but actually throughout the life cycle of whatever that might be. So really being clear that we can really use some of these delivery partners to our best advantage, tapping into that wider industry skill set, what other organisations are doing, how we can think differently. And again, that goes back to that sort of learning methodology.
Yeah, and it's quite pertinent to, just that aspect we talked about earlier on, taking people on the journey, actually going through that. And sometimes, especially in our industry, you probably come into a role, might be new to a role, there are some long-standing third-party relationships, and the natural instinct is, well, I don't know them well enough, I need to get under the skin and see what they are, right?
Yeah.
Have you had scenarios of that sort whereby you come in and you go, wow, these guys are really sort of influencing heavily the outcome of this business, and when you got under the skin, you realize that there were things which needed to be improved and fixed. How did you go about, not severing those relationships, but actually building on those relationships and putting your stamp on it?
Yeah, so absolutely. I think we all come across situations where we inherit a third party, a supplier. Firstly, start off with getting into the nitty-gritty of the contract. Does the contract do what it said on the tin? And then working with that third party and with the organisation of what looks different and what needs to happen. Sometimes it's not just about severing ties with a third party. It's about setting the right baseline in terms of expectations. So your SLAs, who your account management team is, when you need to be achieving the desired outcomes, what that relationship looks like over a period of time, whether we're achieving what we set out to. Doesn't necessarily need to be around severing ties. If the relationship works, it's about resetting the boundaries.
So let's go into what you see as the big challenges coming up for the entire procurement function, taking the technological aspect into account, and what you see as how we should, as a function, really improve and what we should be doing.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, you mentioned it there, technology, but automation, digitalization, AI is going, we know it's only going in one direction. And it's how we think about tapping into those opportunities, whilst also recognising that it might have that direct consequence to people. The idea obviously is to move away from a number of manual tasks that more often than not people are doing versus a system. So I think it's really getting into grips around what automation can do. Understanding more about that digital landscape. So again, we know there's a plethora of information out there, but similarly, we can start to tap in and glean knowledge from organisations through technology, through elements where we can use other third parties that have already done that more wider detailed analysis. So AI is going to be, for me, is key. So really keeping that knowledge bank up, and I think that will be, we'll see a lot of change in that environment.
How do you think AI will impact your role?
I don't necessarily think it will start to impact, certainly over the next number of years, those the more senior strategic level roles. I think the concern I have is losing that knowledge base from that early career piece, because we already see automation in many different guises already within the procurement industry, but actually it's losing the ability to really start from ground zero and build your knowledge base up. And I think my concern is we'll lose that. So it's how we then still continue to get those career progression for everybody, whilst losing that impact of that, the transactional procurement piece I talked about earlier.
And it sounds like you've been thinking about it. So if you see that that's going to be potentially an issue, we're talking about people coming in, learning, getting their hands dirty, understanding data, understanding that information, doing all these transactional activities, which frankly can be automated quite a lot. There's lots of systems out there which are now already putting AI, and it's progressing so rapidly. We're talking every 2-3 months, there's always an improvement there, right? How have you been considering around, what would you do with those initial people who are getting into their career? How would you redeploy them? How do you see that being done in the best way possible?
I think this goes back to that sort of broader mindset of it not just being transactional, it being transformational. So it's what part those individuals can play, not just looking at the data analysis because systems are doing that, not just thinking about how systems are set up to do that element of supplier due diligence, but stepping more into the strategic, the third-party risk piece, the tapping into some of those other opportunities that third parties can give, to gleaning ideas of what else is different, innovation, and really getting somebody to think slightly outside of what would have been a really early career activity to something which is maybe more project focused, where they're getting a little bit more broader experience across the organisation, I think is a great area to focus on.
Yep. Topic I'd like to cover with you. It's one of those which are probably becoming more and more relevant these days. I'm sure you've been reading a lot about, and you've been working on a big project, I know, around bringing offices, making them better, attracting people back in as such. What's your view on that aspect of it? Technology has moved quite at a pace. Actually, stats seem to suggest that if someone works from home, or companies which allow working from home tendentially get a lot of output from people. If you, however, want to build a culture, I'm sure you'll agree that you need to have a good mix.
Yeah.
How do you see that as the way to move forward? Do you see that it is important to have teams spend more time together? At what point? Let's explore that.
Yeah, interestingly, just very close to completing a multi-million-pound refurbishment of the head office in Leeds. So it's actually a fantastic question.
Yeah.
And one of which, over the last 2 years, I've definitely gone around with various parties in the organisation to challenge what, hybrid working principles. How do we get that great balance between the home working, which, as you say, certainly achieves some great outputs in terms of, I feel for me, we've absolutely gone away from presenteeism to very much into that productivity piece. But at the same time, particularly where we've talked about early career professionals, how do we bring people in, co-collaborate in an environment, work more collectively, understand how we can tap in, the talk about it, don't you, those water cooler moments. they are not as easy as we all know in a team's environment. So from my perspective, it's creating a sense of purpose to bring people into the office. And that is creating a very in different areas and space for them to collaborate together. It's around tapping into the right technology. When you're in the office, you've got the ability to use a variety of different areas and space so that you can make your time together more effective. And as I say, it's around creating that sort of sense of purpose. And I really do believe strongly in still trying to bring those teams together, even if it's on a 1 to 2 day basis, but really getting everybody together and learning from each other. And I think we don't always see that in that hybrid home working environment.
I hope you have designed some really nice water coolers in your office space.
I've also found that the key to success is clearly bringing great coffee machines in as well.
Yes,
so that's definitely been the draw.
Great, thank you. And so if we would like to sort of get to a close of this and really get some learnings from you for people who are listening, what 2-3 things would you advise people should do to achieve a similar career and the successes that you have had?
So firstly, I think it's not being fearful. Set yourself a challenge and work to that, because as we talked earlier, it's, whether it's a 2, 3, 5 year challenge, sense of direction, set it and stand by that. Work hard. Working hard for me has been really a significant, I think, benefit in terms of where I am today. And I also, again, co-collaborate, connect, look and seek out those right people, work with coaches, work with mentors, and really start to take the opportunity to learn from others, because that will be, I think, the key to success.
Great. And if someone was looking at this and going, I'd love to work with Lucy or for Lucy or together with Lucy, what would you say they'd gain from being with you in terms of working with you as close as possible?
Hopefully a empowered, exciting, vibrant team that really can that really work together to achieve those common goals and strive for the best, and really start to, from my perspective, that concept of elevating procurement in the sense it should be, that recognised strategic partner of the business.
Great. Thank you. At Procurato, we're lucky enough to work with some incredible experts like you, and we are able to therefore interview some great people for you to get an understanding and learn from. If you feel like you've got a great story that you could share with us, please do reach out to me. If you like what you see, please drop us a like and drop us a follow. Thanks.